You know, you usually only think about the structural integrity of a building when, like, the floorboards actually start shaking.
Right, yeah, when it's too late.
Exactly. I mean, you just assume the foundation is solid, the wiring is safe, the perimeter is secure. But today, we are unpacking a really dense stack of sources that basically map out this massive real-time stress test of the American system.
And it really is from the foundation all the way to the roof.
It is. We're looking at, definitely. And real quick, just an impartiality check before we jump in. We are strictly unpacking the source material here. So regardless of how politically charged some of these topics are, especially with stuff involving the Trump administration and the Supreme Court, we aren't here to take sides. We're just looking at the facts provided.
Exactly. We're just looking at the mechanics of what's happening.
So let's start with the foundation. The sources highlight this crucial hearing at the Supreme Court about birthright citizenship.
Right.
And we are looking at a major push by the administration to challenge who automatically gets citizenship just by being born within U.S. borders. And to me, this is like the ultimate foundational club membership rule, right?
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
But the sources note that the judges appeared super skeptical of this push. Can you kind of unpack that for us? Like, what does that skepticism actually signal?
Well, it signals this really natural tension between the executive branch pushing a policy and the judicial branch's review process. It comes down to textualism. The 14th Amendment has the citizenship clause, right?
Right.
And it says all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., and this is the key phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens.
Okay, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's the sticking point.
Exactly. That's where the legal friction happens. Historically, you know, the common law consensus has interpreted that to mean almost everyone born on U.S. soil, with like really narrow exceptions.
Like foreign diplomats, stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So when an administration tries to reinterpret a foundational clause like that, maybe arguing that children of undocumented immigrants aren't subject to U.S. jurisdiction in the way the amendment intended, they're basically asking the court to overturn decades of entrenched legal interpretation.
Which is huge. And I mean, it makes sense that the justices are asking pointed questions, because if the text is operated one way for over a century, the executive branch is going to have a massive burden of proof to change it.
Right. And the judicial branch's function there is basically to act as the brakes. They're demanding to see the architectural blueprints, asking, you know, how does this new interpretation not cause the entire legal framework of citizenship to just collapse?
Wow. And while that's happening, while the highest court is debating the theoretical rules of who gets to be a citizen, the legislative branch is literally struggling to physically manage the borders.
Oh, the irony is thick.
Right. The sources mention Republicans are close to a deal to end a funding shutdown specifically for the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. It's just this staggering operational paradox to me.
It really is. You've got the courts debating who legally belongs here, while lawmakers are scrambling to just, you know, fund the Coast Guard and border protection.
Yeah, and for you listening, I think it's important to point out, a lot of people assume a shutdown just means like the national parks close or the TSA line takes longer.
Right, the visible stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But it's so much deeper. If procurement is frozen, you're looking at the degradation of the whole security apparatus. Like, you can't upgrade software, you can't buy new surveillance tech.
Yeah, the invisible mechanics of national security basically grind to a halt. The Anti-Deficiency Act stops federal agencies from spending money without congressional approval. So unless it's strictly to protect life and property, it stops.
Which is wild. So the fact that a deal is close, according to the sources, implies that the political leverage of holding out finally bowed to the reality of, well, starving the security perimeter.
Exactly. It shows how grand policy ambitions are completely tethered to the gritty, mundane reality of the budget process.
Totally. So we've got this internal friction defining citizenship and keeping the lights on at DHS. But then, as you mentioned earlier, there's the external side. The global neighborhood is getting volatile.
Very. Internal stability is always tested by global actions.
Yeah. The sources point to major tensions in the Middle East, and there's a specific statement from Trump about an operation involving Iran. He says the operation is, quote, near completion.
Right.
But then the sources explicitly note that there's no clear timeline provided. And I have to push back on that. Like, how can something be near completion with no timeline? It feels like a deliberate paradox.
Well, it's a textbook use of strategic ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity.
Yeah. Tactically, the executive branch uses that kind of language to keep operational flexibility. If you give a hard timeline, you basically hand your adversary a clock. You let them calculate exactly when to counterattack or how long to hold out.
Okay, I get the military advantage of that, but the sources talk about the immediate economic fallout, and looking at that, this strategic ambiguity seems incredibly destructive to the market.
Well, absolutely.
Okay, imagine a home renovation.
Yeah.
You hire a contractor to gut your kitchen.
Oh, God, I've been there. It's awful.
Right. You're eating takeout in your dusty living room for weeks, and you finally ask the contractor, when is the kitchen going to be usable? And if they say, oh, it's near completion, but absolutely refuse to give you a date, you aren't reassured. You are paralyzed.
You can't plan anything.
Exactly. You can't buy groceries. You can't schedule appliance deliveries. Your household capital is frozen because you don't know if near means next Tuesday or next November.
That is a perfect analogy for the global economy right now. The financial markets process information using that exact same psychological mechanism.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Global markets are basically massive risk pricing engines. If you say a conflict will last 6 months and disrupt shipping by 10%, the algorithms adjust instantly. Commodities reprice, the market establishes a baseline.
Because they have the numbers.
Exactly. What they cannot digest is an undefined variable. The unknown timeline introduces this massive risk premium, and it throws the algorithms into chaos.
So that anxious homeowner energy is what's putting intense downward pressure on U.S. markets, like the sources say. Investors are just pulling their money back because they don't know when the kitchen will be done.
Right. And it hits global oil prices, too. The sources highlight that. The Middle East is the central nervous system of global energy. So when you talk about an operation near Iran, which sits on the Strait of Hormuz, where like a fifth of the world's oil passes, traders freak out.
Because they're worried the strait might close.
Exactly. They start buying futures contracts to hedge against that worst-case scenario. And that fear acts almost identically to an actual supply shortage in the short term.
Wow. So the cost of those hedges, that premium paid for geopolitical ambiguity, that just gets passed down the supply chain. So, the refineries pay more, distributors pay more, and suddenly this vague statement in Washington directly hits your wallet at the local gas station.
The political mechanism drives the market mechanism. You just can't separate a nation's foreign policy from its domestic economic stability.
Man, so we're tracking heavy legal battles over citizenship, funding gridlock at DHS, and this geopolitical vagueness squeezing the consumer. It's just friction everywhere.
It is a lot of terrestrial gridlock.
But after all that heavy stuff, human beings have a tendency to look for an escape, literally looking up. And the final set of sources is amazing because NASA is making major headlines with the historic launch of the Artemis II moon mission.
It's an incredible juxtaposition, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, I was reading this and I just felt this pure awe. To me, this is the ultimate aha moment of the deep dive. We've got this messy, complex, earthly politics and then the precise unifying triumph of space exploration.
Yeah, we are moving from the depths of bureaucratic friction to the absolute pinnacle of human engineering. Artemis II is the operational return of humanity to deep space.
But how does that happen? Like, how does a government that is constantly threatening to shut itself down manage to execute a multi-billion-dollar lunar program with that kind of precision?
Well, it comes down to how the funding mechanics are structured. DHS relies on annual appropriations, which makes it super vulnerable to short-term political brinkmanship.
Right, the continuing resolutions and all that.
Exactly. But NASA's major programs, like the Space Launch System and the Orion capsule, they operate on long-led procurement contracts. The aerospace industry requires multi-year commitments.
So the capital is insulated.
Yes, often forward-funded or locked into complex contracts with private sector partners. So the physics of the launch are essentially shielded from the daily politics of the legislature.
Wow. So even if there's a threat of a shutdown, the hardware is paid for, the systems are built, the personnel are essential.
Right. The laws of orbital mechanics are entirely predictable. Thrust and gravity behave exactly how the equations say they will, but political systems are unpredictable. They operate on emotion and ideology. That duality really defines the American posture right now. We have this unparalleled scientific capability alongside this agonizing inability to streamline basic governance. Artemis II shows what the system can do when a goal is clearly defined and mathematically solvable.
Right, whereas the Supreme Court hearings and the DHS funding gaps show the friction when goals are ideological.
Exactly.
So just to give a rapid-fire recap of our journey today, We went from the skepticism of the Supreme Court regarding birthright citizenship straight into the frantic scramble for a DHS funding deal.
Right.
Then we crossed the globe to look at the ambiguous timeline of the Iran conflict, saw how that ambiguity pressured global oil markets, and finally looked up to the Artemis II moon launch.
And why this stack of sources matters so much is that it proves you just cannot look at events in a vacuum.
Absolutely not.
Law, economy, geopolitics, science, they are all overlapping layers of the same daily reality. A disruption in one area forces an adaptation in another. That is the core of being genuinely well-informed today.
I completely agree. And, we've spent this whole time talking about how deeply intertwined our domestic politics, our economic pressures, and international conflicts are here on Earth.
Right.
But it leaves me with this final, really provocative thought for you to ponder on your own. Given how messy things are down here, as missions like Artemis II expand our reach and we establish a permanent foothold on the moon, how long will it be before these earthly tensions follow us into space?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Right. Will we carry our legal and political battles, our resource conflicts, all the way to the lunar surface? Or will space remain the one arena free from the pressures we see in today's headlines? Something to think about the next time you look up at the night sky. Keep analyzing the structures around you, and thanks for taking the deep dive with us.